Welcome to Dead Air Confessions. Late at night, when the streets are empty and the signal begins to fade, people start sharing the things they never say out loud. The strange call they received, the person they saw standing outside, the night they realized they were not alone. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who carried those memories for years. Before we go on air, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a quiet, late-night feel, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions. Turn the volume down low. The line is open.
A lot of that property was privately owned. Looking back, riding through it probably was not the smartest thing we could have done. There were trespassing signs in different places, but where we lived, people did not always take them seriously unless a landowner was actually nearby to enforce them. Most of the property belonged to logging companies. The land was enormous and usually empty. There were no houses, stores, or public roads once you traveled far enough into it. You might see an old logging path, a pile of cut branches, or signs that machinery had passed through years earlier, but most of the time, there was no one around. My dad knew many of the trails and seemed comfortable exploring them. I was around 13 at the time, so I trusted him completely. To me, those rides felt like adventures. I sat behind him while the four-wheeler moved through muddy paths over rocks and between trees. Sometimes branches brushed against my arms or helmet as we passed. The farther we traveled, the quieter the world became. The engine was usually the loudest sound. One day, we were riding high on a mountain through a heavily wooded area. I do not remember exactly where we entered the property or how long we had been traveling before we reached the clearing. We had already gone far enough that I knew walking back would be difficult if something happened to the four-wheeler. There was no phone signal that I remember. There were no nearby houses. If we got stuck or injured, we would have to solve the problem ourselves. The trail continued through the trees until the forest suddenly opened. In front of us was a large, flat clearing filled with tall grass. The grass was high enough that even while I was sitting on the back of the four-wheeler, some of it reached close to my knees. The clearing was shaped almost like a bowl. The center was lower and mostly flat, while the ground around the outer edge rose gradually toward the tree line. The trees formed a dark rim all the way around us. It looked like a place hidden inside the mountain. You could stand in the middle and feel completely cut off from everything beyond the surrounding forest. At first, the clearing seemed like it would be easy to cross. Then we discovered what was underneath the grass. The ground was thick with mud. The grass hid most of it, so my dad could not always see where the tires were going. Some areas were firm enough to support the four-wheeler. Others were soft and deep. The tires sank slightly as we moved, and the engine worked harder to pull us forward. My dad slowed down. We did not want to get stuck in the center of that clearing. We were miles from help, and I was only 13. I could push or gather branches, but I was not strong or experienced enough to be much help if the machine became buried in mud. We moved carefully. The tall grass brushed against my legs. The four-wheeler tilted slightly whenever one wheel dropped into a hidden rut. The entire place made me uncomfortable. Nothing had happened yet, but I remember feeling that we should not be there. The bowl-shaped land and the wall of trees made it seem as though we were exposed in the middle of something. Anyone standing along the tree line could have watched us without being noticed. The grass was too high to see what might be hidden near the ground. Even the mud felt wrong because it forced us to move slowly. If we needed to leave quickly, we might not be able to. I did not tell my dad how uneasy I felt. I did not want him to think I was scared. At 13, I cared a lot about appearing brave around him. He was comfortable in the woods, and I wanted to act as though I was too. Then, a huge spider fell onto me. It dropped from one of the tall pieces of grass and landed directly on my body. I do not know what kind it was, but it was large and thick. It was one of those heavy-looking spiders that seems to have actual weight when it lands. I immediately panicked. But I tried to do it quietly. I did not want to shout and make my dad stop because I was afraid of a spider. I brushed at myself, trying to knock it away without making it obvious that I was losing my mind. Instead of falling to the ground, the spider dropped into the cuff of my pants. That was much worse. I could feel it trapped near my ankle or lower leg while the four-wheeler continued moving. I imagined it crawling upward inside my clothes. Every part of me wanted to jump off. I fought with the pant leg, trying to shake it out while keeping my balance on the back of the vehicle. The grass continued scraping against us, and the four-wheeler rocked over the uneven ground. I finally managed to remove the spider. I remember it as thick and meaty, much larger than anything I wanted touching me. Once it was gone, I sat upright again. That was when I saw the shed. It stood ahead of us in the clearing. It was about the size of an outhouse. The structure was made of wood and painted white, but it looked old. The paint was chipped and peeling. The walls or roof seemed to sag slightly, as though the building had been standing there for years without maintenance. Seeing a structure in such an isolated place immediately caught my attention. Until then, the clearing had seemed completely natural. The shed meant someone had been there. Someone had carried wood, tools, paint, and other materials up the mountain and built it in the middle of the clearing. There was no obvious house nearby, no road suitable for normal cars, no reason I could understand for such a small building to be standing there. Then, I noticed the chain. A metal chain had been wrapped around the middle of the shed several times. Unlike the building, the chain looked relatively new. It did not appear covered in the same age, dirt, or decay as the wood. It was tight around the structure and secured with a padlock. That made the shed much more disturbing. An old abandoned outhouse might make sense. A small storage building left behind by logging workers would also be ordinary. But someone had recently taken the time to wrap a fresh chain around this old structure and lock it. They wanted to keep something out. Or they wanted to keep something inside. I started looking around for more evidence that people were nearby. Maybe there was a cabin hidden at the edge of the clearing. Perhaps workers used the area and stored equipment in the shed. Maybe someone owned the land and visited regularly. I searched the tree line with my eyes, expecting to see a truck, another building, or a person watching us. That was when I saw the post. It was uphill from us, near the tree line on the right side of the clearing. It was about 50 yards away. Something was mounted on top of it. At first, my mind refused to identify what I was looking at. The shape was round and dark. There was long black material hanging from it and blending into the tall grass. I stared, trying to make sense of it. Then I realized it looked like a human head. A head on a stick. I could not look away. I thought distance and fear had to be confusing me. Maybe it was a plastic bag. Perhaps an old jacket had been tied to a post. It might have been an animal skull or a Halloween decoration. But as we continued moving through the clearing, our angle changed, and I could see it more clearly. It looked like the badly decomposed head of a person. The skin appeared brownish and mottled. It hung loosely in places, as though it had dried or decayed. I could still make out what seemed to be eyes and a mouth. The facial features were damaged, but recognizable enough that my mind kept returning to the same conclusion. Human, the long black hair was tangled and caught in the tall grass surrounding the post. Some of it hung downward. Other strands seemed stuck against the vegetation by mud, wind, or age. I remember the head appearing female because of the long hair, though I could not truly identify who it belonged to. There was no body, only the head mounted above the grass. The four-wheeler kept moving. Because of the mud, my dad could not simply accelerate across the clearing. We had to continue slowly. That made the sighting feel endless. I kept expecting someone to emerge from the tree line. My mind immediately created the worst possible explanation. We had entered the territory of some violent family or group living illegally in the woods. The chained shed contained something terrible. The head had been placed there as a warning. Someone was watching us from the trees, waiting to decide what to do. I imagined a crossbow bolt coming from the forest. I imagined a rifle shot. I pictured people stepping out behind us and blocking the only trail back. The entire situation felt like the beginning of a horror movie where the characters realize too late that they have entered a place no outsider is meant to see. I wanted my dad to turn around. At the same time, I did not want to draw attention to us. If anyone was watching, stopping near the head would show that we had noticed it. Perhaps pretending not to see anything was safer. I do not remember whether I told my dad while we were still in the clearing. I may have been too frightened to speak. He kept focusing on the ground and steering through the mud. I stared at the head as we traveled past it. The closer we came, the more certain I felt that it was real. I looked for obvious signs of a mask. A rubber Halloween mask might hang flat or collapse without something filling it. This shape seemed to have the size and weight of an actual head. The features looked irregular rather than painted. The skin did not have the smooth, even color of cheap plastic. The hair looked tangled naturally instead of attached in neat rows. But I was still seeing it from a distance while moving. The light, grass, and angle could have created details that were not truly there. Fear can turn an object into something much worse. Once I believed it was a human head. Every part of the shape supported that belief. The loose material became skin. The dark holes became eyes. The opening became a mouth. The hair became proof. Maybe my mind completed what it expected to see. Eventually, we crossed the clearing and reached firmer ground. Nothing came out of the woods. No one chased us. No weapon was fired. The shed remained closed. The head stayed on the post. We continued riding and later left the property safely. The fact that nothing happened should have made the experience less frightening. Instead, it only made it more mysterious. Whoever had placed the object there never appeared. There was no explanation waiting nearby. The clearing simply existed with an old chained shed and what looked like a decomposed human head standing near the tree line. Afterward, I asked my dad about it. He was dismissive. He said it was probably a Halloween mask. Maybe someone had put it on a stick to frighten trespassers. That explanation made sense on one level. We were on private property. Logging companies and landowners may become tired of people riding four-wheelers through their land. A disturbing decoration could scare visitors away without requiring fences or regular patrols. People also play strange jokes. Someone may have found an old mask, attached hair to it, and placed it near the trail. From 50 yards away, it would look convincing. My dad did not seem interested in treating it as anything more serious. Perhaps he had noticed it too, and did not want to scare me. Maybe he truly believed it was fake. He might also have felt embarrassed that we were trespassing and did not want to involve the police or property owners over a possible decoration. I tried to accept his explanation. But one question kept bothering me. Why put the prank there? The clearing was extremely remote. We had traveled miles through private logging land to reach it. There were no regular visitors, no road traffic, no houses overlooking the area. A Halloween display works because people can see it. A fake head placed in a front yard, beside a road or near a frequently used trail would frighten many people. This one was hidden deep in the mountains, where almost no one would ever find it. If it was meant to scare trespassers, the person who placed it must have expected strangers to enter that exact clearing. That meant someone knew people came through. Maybe the area was not as abandoned as it looked. The chain shed supported that possibility. Someone had recently visited to place or replace the chain. The structure was still important enough to secure. The head could have been a warning intended specifically for people like us. Stay away. Do not open the shed. Do not continue into the property. If that was the purpose, it worked. We never went back. For years, I have tried to think of other explanations. It could have been a mannequin head. Stores, beauty schools, and theaters use realistic heads with wigs. Someone could have aged one with paint, mud, and damage. The long hair and recognizable features would make it look human from a distance. A mannequin head mounted on a post could survive outside longer than a rubber mask. Weather would stain the surface and make the face appear mottled or decayed. The material might sag or crack after exposure to sun and rain. That is a strong possibility. It could also have been an animal. A deer head, bear hide, or other remains might look human from the wrong angle. Long grass tangled around it could resemble hair. Dark openings in a skull can appear like eyes and a mouth. But the shape did not look like any animal head I recognized. I felt I could see human facial proportions. Again, that may have been my mind forcing a familiar pattern onto something unclear. Human beings are very good at finding faces. We see them in clouds, tree bark, and random shadows. A decayed animal head on a post could easily become a human face in the imagination of a frightened 13-year-old. Another possibility is that it was part of hunting activity. Hunters sometimes mount animal remains, leave hides to dry, or use objects to mark territory. The shed may have stored feed, traps, or tools. The chain could have protected equipment from theft or animals. The post may have held a decoy. The black hair could have been fur or fabric. If the area belonged to logging companies, workers or hunters may have used it without leaving obvious signs. The bowl-shaped clearing could also have served a practical purpose. Maybe it was an old work site. The thick mud suggested water collected there. The shed might have covered a pump, well, or other equipment rather than functioning as a room. The chain may have held the damaged structure together. Perhaps the padlock did not secure a door at all. It might have prevented the walls from separating further. That would make the building less mysterious. But it would not explain the head-shaped object nearby. I have wondered whether we should have reported it. If there was even a small chance that the head was real. Authorities should have known. A missing person's family might have been waiting for answers. Evidence could have been left in that clearing while my dad and I rode away. By the time I was old enough to think about that responsibility clearly, years had passed. I did not know the exact location well enough to return alone. The property covered an enormous area with many trails and clearings. Without my dad guiding me, I might never find the same place. Even if I did, the object would probably be gone. Weather, animals, or whoever placed it could have removed everything. At 13, I trusted my dad's judgment. He said it was a mask. I wanted him to be right. Calling the police from private property would also mean admitting that we had been trespassing. That concern should not outweigh the possibility of finding human remains, but it affected how the situation felt at the time. We had entered somewhere we were not supposed to be. Maybe the object was designed to use that fear against us. If we reported it, the landowner could say it was a prank and accuse us of trespassing. So we left and never returned. The memory has changed somewhat over time, as all memories do. I know I was young, frightened, and looking at the object from a moving four-wheeler. I cannot claim with complete certainty that it was a real human head. I never touched it. I never stood close enough to examine it. I did not smell decay or see insects around it. I did not take a photograph. There was no later news report proving someone had been found there. All I can say is that it looked real to me. The details remain clear. Brown, mottled skin, slack features, visible eyes and mouth, long black hair tangled in the grass, the post beneath it, the dark tree line behind it, and the small chained shed standing nearby in the middle of the muddy clearing. Maybe my fear connected those things, even though they had nothing to do with each other. An old maintenance shed, a new chain installed by workers, a Halloween mask placed by teenagers, tall grass and mud making the area seem more threatening. All ordinary pieces. Together they created a horror scene. That is probably the most reasonable explanation. But the location still bothers me. Someone had to carry the mask there. Someone had to mount it on a post. Someone had to wrap the chain around the shed. Those actions required effort. They happened in a place so remote that almost no one would see them. Even if everything was fake, somebody wanted that clearing to look frightening. I sometimes wonder what was inside the shed. We never stopped to check, and I am glad we did not. Maybe it held old tools, fuel, or logging equipment. Perhaps there was nothing inside at all. The chain may have been part of the same prank as the head, making the building look as though it contained something dangerous. But if a person wanted to create that impression, they succeeded. The shed looked less like something protected from theft, and more like something restrained. The chain did not seem intended simply to lock a small door. It was wrapped around the whole structure several times. That detail made it feel as though the building itself needed to remain closed. I know an old wooden shed cannot contain something supernatural simply because it is chained. The wood was probably sagging, and the chain may have supported it. Yet beside the head on the post, the practical explanation became difficult to feel. The clearing had an arrangement to it. The shed near the center. The post near the tree line. The tall grass hiding the mud. The rising land surrounding us. It felt like we had entered a place designed to trap attention. My dad concentrated on keeping the four-wheeler moving. I stared at the head. If anyone had been waiting in the trees, neither of us would have seen them until it was too late. Nothing happened. That fact matters. We crossed the clearing safely. No one approached us. The head did not move. The shed remained shut. Whatever I feared existed only in my imagination. But fear can be a warning, even when the threat never reveals itself. Maybe a real person was watching and chose not to act. Perhaps they only wanted us to leave. Maybe the head was enough. I still remember the slow movement of the four-wheeler through the mud. The tires slipped and pulled. The engine strained. Every second made the head appear slightly larger and clearer. I wanted us to pass it quickly, but the ground would not allow that. It was almost as though the clearing forced us to look. I have never seen anything similar since. I have passed frightening decorations, animal remains, and abandoned buildings. None of them produced the same reaction. The combination of isolation and realism made that object different. There were no people nearby to laugh and admit it was a joke. No house decorated for Halloween. No sign explaining that trespassers were being watched. There was only an old post holding what looked like the remains of a person. My dad's explanation may have been correct. A logging worker or a local teenager could have placed a realistic mask there to scare riders off private land. Maybe they knew people used the trails despite the signs. A hidden clearing would be an effective place for the warning, because anyone who reached it had already traveled deep into the property. The message would feel personal. You are far from help. Someone knows you are here. Turn around. We did not turn around in the clearing because the mud made it difficult. But we left the land and never returned. So if it was meant to keep people away, it worked perfectly. I do not claim we found the scene of a murder. There is no evidence for that. I cannot say the head was human. I was 13, moving past it at a distance and terrified. The rational answer is that it was a mask, mannequin, animal remains, or some other object that looked worse because of the conditions. That is what I tell myself. But whenever I picture that mountain, I do not remember the ride or the fool's gold first. I remember the clearing. I remember the white shed sagging in the tall grass, wrapped several times in a chain that looked much newer than the wood. Then I remember looking toward the tree line and seeing long black hair tangled around a post. I remember the brown, damaged face turned toward the open clearing. And I remember the slow certainty that came over me as we rode past. Whatever my dad believed, and whatever it truly was, someone had put that head there for a reason. And we were probably never supposed to get close enough to see it. Cut through the land like a natural path, disappearing behind trees and reappearing farther down. Before the sale was completed, the previous owner told my uncle that the property was supposedly located on the site of an ancient Native American burial ground. My uncle did not take the claim seriously. He is a businessman, and his first thought was that the seller was trying to make the property sound mysterious or historically important so he could justify a higher price. People sometimes attach dramatic stories to land. They say there was a battle there, someone was buried nearby, or the place is haunted. Those stories can make ordinary property seem rare or special. My uncle assumed this was the same kind of thing. There was no paperwork or clear evidence offered to support the story. As far as he was concerned, it was only something the seller said. He did not tell the rest of the family. Part of the reason was that he did not believe it himself. The other reason was that he did not want anyone becoming frightened or refusing to visit the property because of an unverified story. He only mentioned it to me. Not long after he bought the land, the two of us decided to spend a day exploring it. We followed the creek, walked through the wooded areas, and looked around for anything interesting. It was more of an adventure than a serious investigation. We were not searching for graves, artifacts, or evidence of the seller's claim. We were simply enjoying the property and learning what was there. The creek gave us something to follow, though the ground around it was sometimes rough. There were rocks of different sizes scattered through the water and along the banks. Some were partly buried in mud, while others had been exposed by the moving water. We spent hours walking and examining things. At one point, we found several bright, metallic-looking pieces of rock. For a moment, they looked exciting. They caught the light in a way that made them resemble gold, but they were only fool's gold. Still, finding them made the day feel productive. We collected or examined a few pieces and continued along the creek. By the end of the day, we reached a much larger rock. It stood out immediately because it was far bigger than any of the others nearby. It was probably about the size of a pickup truck. It looked as though it had been sitting in the same place for a very long time. A thick layer of moss covered much of its surface. The moss made the rock look softer and less defined than it really was. It hid the shape beneath it and gave the surface a deep green color. For some reason, my uncle and I decided it would be fun to peel some of the moss away. There was no serious purpose behind it. We were curious about what the stone looked like underneath. We started pulling at the moss with our hands. Some sections came away easily, while others clung tightly to the rock. As we removed more of it, we exposed something neither of us expected. There was a large, perfectly round hole in the middle of the rock. The opening was filled with water. It did not look like a rough crack or a natural depression worn unevenly over time. The edges appeared smooth and circular. The hole looked too perfect. It was large enough that it immediately became the most interesting thing we had found all day. We looked closely at it, trying to understand how it could have formed. There were no obvious machine marks. It did not look as though someone had recently drilled into the stone. The rock was far too large and old looking for the hole to be part of some modern garden decoration. The water inside was still. We could not easily tell how deep it was. Perhaps rain had filled it. Maybe it connected to groundwater or the nearby creek. We did not put much thought into it at the time. Natural processes can create unusual shapes in stone. Water can wear away rock over long periods. Smaller stones caught in a depression may spin in currents and slowly create a rounded pothole. Freeze and thaw cycles can also enlarge openings. The creek may once have flowed differently and worn the hole into the rock centuries ago. There were reasonable explanations. My uncle still believed the burial ground story was nonsense, and I did not see the hole as proof of anything. We did not find bones. There were no carved symbols, tools, or objects around it. It was only a strange formation in a very large rock. After looking at it for a while, we continued exploring or eventually returned home. Neither of us told my aunt about the seller's claim. She did not know that the previous owner had mentioned a burial ground. As far as she knew, my uncle had simply bought land near their home. She also did not know that we had uncovered the round, water-filled hole in the rock. Nothing happened immediately after our visit. The land remained quiet. There were no strange noises at the house. No one reported seeing people near the creek. My uncle did not suddenly become ill or have nightmares. For about a week, the whole thing seemed like nothing more than an interesting day outdoors. Then, my aunt woke up after having a disturbing dream. She told my uncle about it. The dream began outside their home, but the house did not look the way it did in real life. It looked much older. The building appeared abandoned, as though no one had lived there for many years. The outside was worn and neglected. The feeling was not that she had gone to a different location. It was as though her own house had changed into an older version of itself. She went inside. The interior was not the inside of their real home either. The rooms were arranged differently. The house felt dark and unfamiliar. There was a large, shadowy room inside. She moved through it and eventually reached the bedroom. When she looked into the room, she saw herself. She was standing in the doorway, but another version of her was floating above the bed. That alone would have made the dream frightening. She could see her own body suspended over the place where she normally slept. Beside the floating version of herself sat a Native American man. He was sitting cross-legged near the bed. He did not attack her. He did not speak. He simply stared at her. The figure seemed calm but deeply unsettling. He watched the version of my aunt standing in the doorway while her other body floated beside him. That was the image she remembered most clearly. An ancient-looking house, a dark bedroom, her own body lifted over the bed, and a silent man sitting beside her, staring. My aunt told my uncle the dream without knowing anything about the history the seller had claimed. She had not heard the words burial ground. She had not been told about the land's possible connection to Native American history. She did not know what we had found near the creek. That was when my uncle became frightened. He had dismissed the seller's story immediately. But now his wife had described a dream involving a Native American figure only about a week after he and I had explored the property. The land was only around 400 yards from their house. It was close enough to walk to. Whatever the seller believed was connected to the property was not far away from where my aunt slept. My uncle finally told her what he had been told. He explained that the previous owner had claimed the land was the site of an ancient burial ground. He told her that he had kept the story quiet because he assumed it was an attempt to increase the value of the property or make it sound more mysterious. Then he told her about our day near the creek and the enormous moss-covered rock. He described the perfectly round hole filled with water. My aunt was shocked. She had not known any of it before the dream. That was what made the timing so difficult to ignore. If she had heard the burial ground story first, the dream would have been easy to explain. She could have been thinking about the land before going to sleep. Her mind could have taken the story and created frightening images from it. That happens often. People hear that a house is haunted and then begin having dreams about ghosts. Someone talks about a graveyard, and the listener dreams of dead people. But my aunt had not been given the suggestion. She had produced the image independently. At least, that is how everyone remembered it. That does not automatically prove anything paranormal happened. Information can reach people without a clear memory of hearing it. My aunt may have overheard part of a conversation between my uncle and me. Perhaps we mentioned the seller's claim while she was nearby and did not realize she had heard. She might have heard something from another relative or neighbor. The previous owner could have told other people in the area, and the story may already have been circulating. Even a brief comment forgotten during the day can influence a dream later. The mind stores far more than people consciously remember. It is possible that my aunt knew something without realizing where the information came from. There is also the possibility of coincidence. Dreams contain unusual people, unfamiliar houses, floating bodies, and frightening scenes all the time. A Native American figure appearing in one dream does not prove that the nearby land contained a burial ground. It may only feel meaningful because of what my uncle already knew. If he had never heard the seller's claim, he might have treated the dream as strange but unrelated to the property. The connection existed because two unusual ideas matched. Human beings are naturally good at finding patterns. Sometimes those patterns are real. Sometimes they are created after the events happen. My aunt's dream also reflected common images from movies, television, stories, and popular culture. The abandoned house, floating body, and silent figure are all familiar dream symbols. She could have created the entire scene without any external cause. The Native American man may have represented age, land, warning, or something from her own past. Dreams combine symbols without explaining them. But the timing remained uncomfortable. The dream happened shortly after we disturbed the moss covering the enormous rock. My uncle and I had exposed something hidden. We did not know whether the hole had any meaning. Maybe it was only a natural formation. But after the dream, it no longer felt completely harmless. We began wondering whether we had uncovered something that should have been left alone. Perhaps the rock had been important to someone long ago. The round hole might have been used to hold water, offerings, or some other object. It could have been connected to ceremonies or daily life. We had no evidence for that. We were not archaeologists, historians, or experts in indigenous cultures. It would be wrong to invent a meaning simply because the rock looked unusual. Still, the possibility entered our minds. The seller's story, the giant stone, the hidden hole, the dream. Everything began to feel connected. My uncle, who had originally laughed off the burial ground claim, became much more willing to believe the land held some kind of history or presence. I felt the same way. The dream did not prove that graves were there, but it made us take the story seriously. We also began thinking about the old appearance of the house in my aunt's dream. Maybe she was not seeing the future, or a random, abandoned version of their home. Perhaps she was seeing what the land looked like before the present house existed. That interpretation does not fit perfectly, because the building was still a house, only much older and unfamiliar inside. It may have represented the idea that the home stood on land with a past. The modern structure disappeared, and something older took its place. The bedroom remained important because that was where my aunt slept. The figure sitting beside her floating body might have been warning her that something from the land could reach the house. Or it might have been doing nothing more than observing her. Again, these are interpretations added later. The dream itself contained no spoken message. The man did not say the land belonged to him. He did not threaten the family or ask anyone to leave. He only stared. That silence made the dream more unsettling. There was no clear action my uncle could take. If it was a warning, what was he supposed to do? Sell the land? Stop visiting it? Cover the hole again? Ask someone to examine the property? Without knowing whether the burial ground claim was even true. Any response would be based on fear. The most responsible action would have been to research the land properly. Historical maps, local records, tribal contacts, and archaeological experts might have revealed whether the area was known to contain graves or culturally important sites. The seller's statement alone was not reliable evidence. People often misuse Native American burial ground stories to make land sound haunted. Those stories can be disrespectful because they reduce real indigenous history and burial practices to a horror story explanation. My uncle did not know whether the seller had any factual basis for what he said. It is possible he invented the whole thing. The strange rock may also have been completely natural. Rounded holes in large rocks can form through erosion. If the creek once moved around or over the stone, pebbles trapped in one area might have spun for years, grinding the surface into a circular shape. The moss would later cover the opening. Rainwater would fill it. My uncle and I peeled the moss away and found something geologically interesting, not ceremonial. That explanation is very plausible. The fact that the hole looked perfect does not mean a person created it. Nature produces circles, spirals, and smooth surfaces. People often assume a shape is artificial simply because it looks organized. The creek had probably been shaping the land long before any modern buildings existed. The fool's gold we found was also evidence that the area had interesting geology. The same natural processes that exposed mineral deposits could have formed the hole. If so, the rock had nothing to do with my aunt's dream. The events happened close together by chance. Still, the coincidence gave all of us chills. My aunt had no reason to dream about a Native American man at that exact time. She had not visited the rock. She had not heard the seller's story. She did not know my uncle and I had been thinking about the possibility of something old connected to the land. Yet her dream placed that figure beside her body in a house transformed by age and abandonment. My uncle told her the truth only after she described it. That order is what made the experience powerful. The information did not seem to shape the dream. The dream appeared to confirm the information. At least, that was how it felt. There is another possibility that the dream reflected my aunt's awareness of the land in a broader way. She knew my uncle had recently purchased property. Buying land is a major event. It can bring financial stress, uncertainty, and fear about the future. Even without hearing the burial ground story, she may have worried about what the purchase meant. The old abandoned house could represent insecurity. The floating body could represent a lack of control. The silent figure could represent the unknown history of the land. Her mind may have created a symbolic dream about change. Then, my uncle's story gave the dream a more literal interpretation. That explanation respects the timing without assuming anything paranormal. It also explains why the dream centered on their home rather than the creek. The land purchase affected the family's sense of safety and stability, but my aunt said she had not been worried about it. She did not consciously fear the property. She had no reason to imagine someone from the distant past sitting beside her bed. Dreams do not require conscious fear, though they often express concerns people do not recognize while awake. Whatever the cause, the incident changed how we thought about the property. Before the dream, it was simply land with a creek. The seller's burial ground claim was an attempt to make the place sound interesting. The hole in the rock was a natural curiosity. After the dream, the property felt older. It felt as though there were parts of its history we did not understand. Walking near the creek no longer felt completely casual. The large rock became something we remembered with more caution. We had peeled away the moss because we were bored and curious. Now we wondered whether exposing the hole had been disrespectful. I do not know whether my uncle ever covered it again. I do not know whether anyone researched the property further. As far as I know, there were no repeated dreams or ongoing paranormal events. My aunt did not continue seeing the man. Nothing appeared beside her bed while she was awake. The house did not become haunted in an obvious way. There were no footsteps, voices, moving objects, or unexplained illnesses connected to the land. That lack of repetition supports coincidence. One strange dream occurred after one strange discovery. Then life continued. If something had been awakened or disturbed, I might expect more. On the other hand, perhaps the dream was the only response. Maybe it was enough to make us pay attention. If there was a message, it may not have been a threat. The figure did not attack my aunt. He sat beside her and watched. Perhaps the dream only communicated that the land had a history and that the family should not dismiss it. That is the interpretation my uncle and I found easiest to accept. We did not become certain that ghosts lived near the creek. We became convinced that there might be truth behind the seller's story. There is an important difference. A burial ground would be a real historical and cultural site, not simply a haunted place. If graves were present, they deserved respect, whether or not spirits existed. The dream made us realize that laughing off the claim might have been careless. Even if the seller exaggerated, the land may still have had significance to people long before my uncle owned it. Ownership documents do not erase history. The creek, rock, and soil were there before any of us. That was perhaps the strongest lesson from the experience. I still think about the huge rock. I remember pulling away the moss and revealing the dark circle beneath it. The water inside looked calm and old. We treated it like an interesting discovery. We did not ask why the moss had grown over it or how long the opening had remained hidden. Maybe the hole was only a product of water and time. That is the most likely answer. But after hearing my aunt's dream, it became impossible to see it as completely ordinary. I also think about the distance between the land and the house. 400 yards is not far. Whatever history belonged to that property was close enough to be part of the same landscape. A modern property line might separate the house from the creek, but older people would not necessarily have understood or used the land in the same way. If there had once been a settlement, burial site, or ceremonial area nearby, it could have extended farther than anyone realized. Again, there was no proof, only possibility. The story has remained with me because the pieces came together in such a specific order. The seller told my uncle about the burial ground claim. My uncle dismissed it and kept it secret. We explored the land. We uncovered a perfectly round, water-filled hole in a moss-covered rock the size of a truck. A week later, my aunt dreamed of an abandoned version of her home, saw herself floating above her bed, and saw a Native American man sitting beside her and staring. Then, and only then, my uncle told her what he knew. Had she heard the story first, I would not find the dream nearly as strange. Had we not discovered the rock, it might have seemed like an unrelated nightmare. Had the land been miles from the house, the connection would feel weaker. But everything happened close together. Maybe that is only how coincidences work. Several ordinary events occur near one another and create a pattern that feels intentional. The human mind remembers the matching details and forgets all the dreams and discoveries that lead nowhere. That may be exactly what happened. My aunt could have dreamed of any person. She dreamed of someone whose presence matched the claim connected to the land. The coincidence became memorable because it fit. I understand that explanation, but I still get chills when I think about it. My uncle had treated the story like a sales tactic. He believed the previous owner was making things up to increase the value of the property. He had not told his wife because there was nothing worth telling. Then she described a dream containing the one detail she supposedly could not have known. After that, none of us could laugh at the claim in the same way. I cannot honestly say the land was haunted. I cannot say the rock was connected to a burial or that the man in the dream was a spirit. There was never enough evidence for those conclusions. But something about the sequence felt like a warning against dismissing the past too easily. My uncle bought the land as property. We explored it as entertainment. We peeled moss from a stone because we were curious. A week later, my aunt dreamed of a silent man beside her floating body in a house that looked older than her own. Maybe her mind created the image by chance. Maybe she had unconsciously heard part of the story. Or maybe something connected to that land wanted the new owners to understand that the property had never truly been empty. Whatever the truth was, my uncle stopped believing that the seller's words were only an attempt to raise the price. And I stopped seeing the hole in that enormous rock as just another strange thing we found beside the creek. Because my aunt knew nothing about the story. Yet in her dream, someone from that story was already sitting beside her bed. With around 6 separate buildings spread across the land. Some looked like classrooms, while others appeared to be dormitories or administrative buildings. By the time I lived there, the entire place had been abandoned. No students arrived in the morning, no teachers parked outside, no lights turned on at night. Most of the windows were dark, and the buildings stood empty behind old paths, overgrown patches of land, and outdoor equipment no one maintained anymore. There were very old swings and other playground toys still on the property. The metal was worn, and the paint had faded over time. Some of the equipment looked as though it had been left exactly where the last children had used it. The neighborhood kids and I would sometimes go over there and play. We knew we probably were not supposed to be on the property, but no one ever seemed to be there to stop us. It felt like an enormous playground that had been forgotten by everyone except the children living nearby. During the day, the school was more interesting than frightening. We would wander around the grounds, use the old swings, and look through windows into the empty buildings. The rooms usually contained almost nothing. There might be a single chair left in the middle of a room, a broken table, pieces of wood, or random debris scattered across the floor. It looked like people had removed everything valuable and abandoned whatever was not worth carrying away. Some rooms were completely empty. Others contained small pieces of the school's past, but nothing that suggested anyone still used the buildings. I never saw workers, guards, students, or people living inside. As far as we knew, the place remained empty. From our house, we had a clear view of the entrance to one of the larger buildings. I always assumed it had once been a dormitory. Through the entrance, there appeared to be rooms on both the left and right sides. The rooms on the ground level had enormous square windows. They stretched almost from the floor to the ceiling, making it easy to see inside from across the street. There were no curtains. There were no blinds. Nothing covered the glass. During daylight, I could look directly into those rooms and see empty floors, bare walls, and bits of debris. That clear view is important because I knew what those rooms normally looked like. There was no furniture arranged for a gathering. There were no curtains hanging inside. There was no record player or large group of people. They were abandoned rooms. One night, I was playing in my brother's bedroom. I never had a bedroom of my own, so I often spent time in his room when I was allowed to. His room was at the front of the house, and its window faced the old school. It could not have been very late. My mother was strict about bedtime, so I would normally have been sent to bed around 8 or 9. It was dark outside, but the rest of the neighborhood had not completely gone silent yet. I do not remember what I was playing with or why I looked toward the window. Nothing had made a sound across the street. There was no flash of light or movement that first caught my attention. I simply looked out. One of the large ground floor windows in the old dormitory looked different. There appeared to be a curtain covering it from the inside. Behind that curtain, I could see shadows moving. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at. The building was supposed to be empty. I had seen inside the room many times during the day, and there had never been anything that could create what I saw. But that night, it looked as though an old-fashioned party was happening inside. I could not see actual people. I saw only their silhouettes against the curtain, like a shadow puppet show. The figures moved back and forth across the room. There were several of them. They did not look exactly human in shape. Their bodies appeared unusually square, almost like cardboard cutouts instead of real people. The closest comparison I can make is Professor Utonium from the Powerpuff Girls. The figures had broad, block-like bodies with straight edges, rather than the soft, uneven shapes of ordinary people. They seemed flat. They moved from side to side behind the curtain as if they were dancing or walking through a crowded room. The scene reminded me of the part in Home Alone where Kevin uses cutouts and other objects to make it look as though his family is having a party inside the house. From outside, you only see silhouettes moving behind the windows. That was almost exactly what the abandoned school looked like, except no one should have been inside controlling anything. I watched the figures pass one another. Some seemed to turn or lean. Others moved repeatedly across the same area. It looked lively, as though a room that had been dead and empty during the day had suddenly filled with guests from another time. There was also a table visible in silhouette. On top of it was what looked like an old record player. At the time, I did not know the correct name for it. It had a large flower-shaped horn where the sound would come out, like the old gramophones shown in movies or cartoons. The horn formed a clear silhouette against the curtain. It was one of the strongest details in the whole scene. I could see the table, the base of the machine, and the wide opening of the horn. Everything looked old-fashioned. The people did not seem dressed or shaped like modern adults. The record player did not look like anything that should have been sitting inside an abandoned room in the late 20th or early 21st century. The entire scene seemed to belong to a much earlier period. The silhouettes moved around it as if music were playing. I could not hear music from across the street. The old school remained silent. There was no sound of conversation, footsteps, or laughter. There were only the shadows moving behind the curtain. That silence made the sight more confusing. If real people had broken into the building to hold a party, I should have seen lights, flashlights, or normal human movement. I might have heard voices or music. The figures should have had recognizable arms, heads, and bodies. Instead, they looked like flat cutouts being moved back and forth, yet I could not see anyone operating them. I stayed at the window and watched. I do not remember exactly how long the party continued. It may have lasted only a few minutes, though it felt longer because I was trying so hard to understand it. I looked away and back again, expecting the scene to disappear. It remained. The shadows continued crossing behind the curtain. I began wondering whether someone had moved into the old building without the neighborhood knowing. Perhaps workers were using the room. Maybe teenagers had broken in and hung up a sheet for some kind of show. But why would they use an antique-looking record player? Why did all the people look square and flat? Why was there suddenly a curtain in a window that had always been uncovered? I went to find my mother. I told her there was a party happening inside the abandoned school. I tried to explain the shadows, the curtain, the people, and the old record player. She did not believe me. She probably thought I was imagining things or trying to delay bedtime. From her perspective, the school was abandoned and dark. A child claiming to see an old-fashioned party through one of its windows sounded like a story created by shadows and imagination. She told me to go away or return to what I had been doing. I do not remember whether she came to the window. I do not think she did. That always bothered me. If she had looked, she might have seen the same thing and confirmed that it was there. Or she might have seen only an empty window and shown me that I had misunderstood a reflection. Instead, I returned with no explanation. I do not remember exactly when the scene ended. At some point, the window returned to normal. The curtain was gone. The room looked empty again. The silhouettes were no longer moving behind the glass. There was no table, no old record player, no party. The next time I saw the room during daylight, it looked just as abandoned as before. There was only debris on the floor and nothing arranged near the window. I never saw that exact scene again. That should make it easy to dismiss as a childhood misunderstanding. I was young. It was dark, and I was looking across a street into a large, abandoned building. There are many ways light and reflections could have created strange images. A television inside our house might have reflected in my brother's window. Perhaps I was not seeing something across the street at all. Maybe images from the room behind me appeared faintly over the view of the school, making it seem as though figures were moving inside the distant building. Windows can become mirrors at night. When the interior of a house is brighter than the outside, objects and people inside are reflected in the glass. If someone walked behind me, their reflection could have appeared over the abandoned room across the street. A lamp, toy, or piece of furniture might have created the shape of the record player. That is a reasonable explanation. But I remember the scene appearing inside one specific school window. It did not seem to be floating across the whole view. The curtain had clear boundaries that matched the large square window. The figures remained behind it. They moved as though they occupied the room across the street, not my brother's room. Perhaps my young mind placed the reflection there because that was where I expected it to be. Children can misunderstand depth and reflections, especially at night. The brain combines what is inside the glass with what is visible beyond it. A reflection from our house may have blended perfectly with the empty schoolroom. The Home Alone comparison could also explain why I interpreted the shapes as a party. If I had seen that movie before, my mind already knew the image of fake people dancing behind a curtain. Random moving shadows might have reminded me of it immediately. I then filled in details such as guests, music, and a celebration. The block-like bodies may have been ordinary reflections distorted by distance. The record player might have been a lamp with a wide shade or another object in my brother's room. That explanation covers much of the experience. However, I do not remember anyone else being in the bedroom while I watched. I was playing alone. If the shadows came from our house, something would have needed to move repeatedly behind me. The figures across the street seemed numerous and active. They crossed in both directions, creating the impression of several people. There was no group of people moving around in our home. My mother was elsewhere in the house, and the rest of the family was not having a party behind me. Passing car headlights are another possibility. Cars traveling along the street could have projected shadows through trees, fences, or objects near the abandoned school. As each vehicle moved, the light might have caused shapes to cross the windows. The broad square silhouettes could have been parts of cars, signs, or tree trunks. A shadow shaped like a table and gramophone might have resulted from several objects overlapping. If traffic passed regularly, the movement could repeat and seem like dancing. But I do not remember cars moving through the scene. The lights did not sweep across the building in the normal way headlights do. The window seemed illuminated steadily from behind the curtain. The silhouettes appeared inside it. There may also have been trespassers in the building. The fact that we neighborhood children entered the property proves it was accessible. Teenagers or adults could have gone inside at night. They may have carried a sheet or curtain and used a light behind it. The square figures could have been people wearing coats or carrying objects. The gramophone silhouette might have been part of a prank, school project, or decoration. Perhaps someone was deliberately creating a shadow show. That would explain the curtain and moving figures without requiring anything paranormal. Still, it would have been an elaborate thing to do inside an abandoned dormitory late at night. The people would need to bring lights, props, and a large old-fashioned record player, or a cutout shaped like one. There was no obvious audience. I was probably the only person watching from across the street. If it was a prank, I do not know who it was intended to frighten. It is possible that the building was not as empty as I believed. Maybe one section was used for storage, theater rehearsals, or private events. The room could have contained old materials connected to the school's history. Someone might have been moving historical displays, including a gramophone and human-shaped cutouts. Because I was a child, I may not have known about activity taking place there. But during all the times we played on the property, I never saw signs that people regularly used the rooms. There were no curtains, maintained paths, working lights, or secured entrances. Everything looked abandoned. The old-fashioned nature of the party is the detail that continues to disturb me. If I had seen modern-looking people moving through the room, I would assume trespassers. Instead, the silhouettes looked like flat figures from another period. The gramophone made the scene feel like a memory of the building rather than something happening in the present. St. Scholastica had once been a girls' school. There must have been dances, gatherings, music, and celebrations there when it was active. Students may have lived in those dormitories for years. Perhaps the room I saw had once been used for social events. Maybe someone had placed a gramophone on a table while girls danced around it. That is the paranormal explanation my mind returns to. What if I saw an old scene repeating inside the abandoned building? Not conscious ghosts watching me, but an image left behind by something that happened there many times. Some people call that a residual haunting. The idea is that intense or repeated events somehow leave an impression on a location. Under certain conditions, the scene plays again like a recording. The figures do not react to witnesses because they are not aware. They simply repeat movements from the past. That would explain why the silhouettes never noticed me. They moved back and forth as though following an old pattern. The record player remained on the table. The party continued without sound. Then it ended, and the room returned to emptiness. I do not know whether residual hauntings are real. There is no reliable evidence that buildings can record human activity in that way. The idea is appealing because it matches what I saw, But matching a story does not prove the explanation. My memory may also have changed. I was young when it happened. Years have passed, and I have thought about the window many times. Each time I remember it, details may become clearer or more dramatic. Perhaps I originally saw only 2 or 3 moving shadows. Over time, they became a full party. Maybe the record player was less distinct than I now imagine. The comparison to Home Alone and Professor Utonium may have shaped the memory later. Childhood memories often preserve the feeling of an event while changing exact images. I have to admit that possibility. But I vividly remember the large flower-shaped horn. I remember understanding that it was a machine for playing music, even though I did not know its proper name. I remember the block like people crossing behind the curtain. I remember going to my mother because I believed something impossible was happening across the street. Those details have remained consistent. I also remember the frustration of not being believed. If I had only imagined a quick shadow, I might have forgotten it. Instead, the scene felt important enough that I left my brother's room and tried to get an adult to look. My mother's dismissal left me alone with the question. That is probably one reason I still think about it. There was never a second witness to tell me whether the window actually looked different that night. I sometimes wonder whether other people living near the school ever saw anything similar. Perhaps someone else noticed lights in the windows or heard music coming from the abandoned buildings. Maybe neighborhood children told stories about figures moving inside. I do not remember hearing any at the time. The property itself was naturally creepy enough that people may have invented stories without seeing anything. Old schools carry a strong atmosphere when abandoned. Empty dormitories suggest lives interrupted. Rows of windows look like eyes. Playground equipment moves in the wind. A single chair in an empty room seems deliberately placed, even when it was left randomly. Children visiting such a place are likely to imagine ghosts. That atmosphere may have influenced me, even if I did not consciously think the school was haunted. I knew the buildings were old. I knew girls had once lived and studied there. Looking through the windows, I could imagine the rooms filled with people. At night, my mind may have supplied the missing activity. Perhaps I stared at shadows long enough for the empty room to become a party. The brain searches for patterns. It sees people in curtains, faces in windows, and movement in still darkness. A child's imagination can turn those patterns into a complete scene. Still, it did not feel imagined. The figures moved continuously. The curtain had a clear surface. The gramophone stayed in place while the party moved around it. I felt as though I was watching something real, even if I could not understand what kind of reality it belonged to. The silence was what made it feel most removed from the present. There should have been music. A gramophone with that huge horn existed to fill a room with sound. The people seemed to be dancing, but nothing crossed the street. No faint melody, no voices, no laughter. The room looked alive while remaining completely silent. It was like watching an old film with the sound removed. If the scene was a reflection, that silence makes sense. If it was a group of trespassers, it is harder to explain. Maybe the windows were thick enough to block the sound. The road in the distance could have prevented me from hearing anything. I was inside my own house, behind another closed window. There may have been 2 layers of glass and an entire street between us. Even a real party could have been silent from my position. But light should have been visible around the edges of the curtain or through other windows. I do not remember seeing activity anywhere else in the building. Only that one room appeared occupied. The rest of St. Scholastica remained dark. That single bright square made it seem like an opening into another time. I have wondered whether the curtain itself was real. During the day, the windows were uncovered. If someone had hung a curtain for one night, They must have removed it before anyone saw it again. A reflection could create the appearance of a curtain more easily. The glow from our house might have turned the dark school window into a screen. Shadows from inside our room could have played across it. That remains the most rational explanation. The window acted like a mirror, and I misunderstood where the images were located. Maybe the party was happening in fragments inside my own house. Someone walking in another room. A lamp, shaped like a horn. Furniture reflected at strange angles. My young brain assembled them into one scene. If so, the experience shows how convincing reflections can be. I was not merely confused for a second. I watched long enough to see a whole gathering. I believed the abandoned room had filled with square people dancing around an old record player. The explanation may be ordinary, but the illusion was extraordinary. I never saw the party again. No other window lit up. No figure appeared close to our house. Nothing followed me from the school. That one sighting is the only event I can connect directly to St. Scholastica. Because it happened once, I cannot establish a pattern. There is no way to recreate the exact lighting, weather, and conditions now. The buildings may have changed or been demolished. Even if I stood in my brother's old room at the same hour, the view would not necessarily be the same. The moment is gone. All I have is the memory of looking across the road at a building I knew was empty. Inside one of its bare ground floor rooms, a curtain had appeared. Behind it, flat square people moved from side to side as though dancing. A table stood among them. On that table was the unmistakable silhouette of an old gramophone with a wide, flower-shaped horn. I told my mother. She did not believe me. By daylight, the room was empty again. Maybe someone had broken in. Maybe headlights and reflections created a perfect shadow show. Maybe my childhood imagination turned ordinary movement into an old-fashioned party. Those are all possible. But when I remember it, I still see the figures moving with the same strange rhythm. They did not act like people who had entered an abandoned building for fun. They looked like cutouts, repeating movements they had performed many times before. The school had been empty for years, but for a few minutes that night, one room seemed to remember what it had once been. Then, the curtain vanished. The party ended, and St. Scholastica went back to standing silently across from our house, as though nothing inside it had ever moved.
We will get back to the next confession in a moment. If you are new here, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more real stories from people who experienced something they still cannot explain. Your support helps keep these late-night broadcasts alive. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has unsettled you the most so far. Now, let's return to the signal.
For driving through an area neither of them knew very well. They had been given directions to a party, but this was long before mobile phones, GPS, or digital maps. If you missed a turn, you could not simply look at a screen and let a voice guide you back. You had to rely on written directions, street signs, landmarks, or whatever someone had told you before you left. At some point, they took a wrong turn. At first, they probably assumed they would recognize the mistake quickly and find their way back. Instead, the road led them farther from the familiar streets and deeper into a quiet area. There were fewer lights. The houses became more spread out. Eventually, the road began climbing a hill. They continued upward, hoping they might reach another street that would take them back toward the party. When they reached the top, they found themselves in what appeared to be a new housing development. There were several homes being built, but many were unfinished. Some may have been little more than frames and foundations. Others looked complete from the outside, but were still empty. There were construction materials, bare lots, and dark spaces between the buildings. Because no one had moved in yet, the whole area was unusually quiet. There were no families outside, no porch lights, no television glow behind curtains, no cars regularly passing through. It felt less like a neighborhood and more like the unfinished shell of one. My mother and her boyfriend realized they were nowhere near the party. They needed to turn around and go back down the hill. Before doing that, her boyfriend said he needed to urinate. Since the area appeared deserted, he pulled over. He stopped the car near the side of the road and got out. My mother remained inside while he walked a short distance away. At first, nothing seemed wrong. She probably watched him disappear into the darkness beside one of the empty lots or unfinished houses. She may have looked around the car, waiting for him to return so they could continue searching for the party. Then, he came back. The moment he got into the car, she could tell something had frightened him. He was no longer relaxed. He appeared panicked and wanted to leave immediately. He started the car or put it into gear and began turning around to head back down the hill. Before driving away, however, he let my mother see what had scared him. He pointed her attention farther down the block. The headlights landed on another car parked in the darkness. Inside that vehicle was a human figure. The person was sitting completely still. They appeared to have some kind of white fabric covering their head. My mother described it as a mask, but it did not sound like a normal costume mask with clear features. It seemed more like a piece of pale cloth pulled over the entire head. The figure did not wave. It did not react normally to the headlights. It sat inside the car without moving. From that distance, neither my mother nor her boyfriend could see a face beneath the fabric. There was only the shape of a person and the pail covering over the head. The sight was strange enough on its own. They were at the top of an isolated hill in a neighborhood that had not been completed yet. It was late at night, and another car was parked there with someone sitting inside wearing a white mask. There was no obvious reason for that person to be there. Maybe it was a construction worker or security guard. Perhaps someone else had taken a wrong turn. It could have been a teenager playing a prank. But the stillness and the covered face immediately made the situation feel dangerous. My mother's boyfriend did not wait to find out who it was. He turned their car around and began driving back toward the road that led down the hill. Then the other car moved. The masked person began following them. At first, the vehicle may simply have pulled onto the road behind them. That alone would have been frightening after what they had just seen, but the driver did not keep a normal distance. The car came up close behind them. Then it struck their bumper. My mother's boyfriend accelerated. The other vehicle stayed with them. It continued following them down the hill and hitting or pushing against the rear of their car. The masked driver was not merely traveling in the same direction. The person appeared to be chasing them. My mother's boyfriend began flooring the accelerator. The road down the hill may have been curved or narrow, especially in a new development where lighting and markings were limited. Driving fast there at night was dangerous, but slowing down felt even worse. Each time the other car came close, they expected another impact. My mother could probably see the headlights filling the rear window. She knew the person behind them was the same figure they had seen sitting motionless with the white fabric over their head. Now that figure was controlling a moving vehicle and trying to stay directly behind them. They did not know what the driver wanted. Maybe the person wanted them to stop. Perhaps they were being pushed toward the side of the road. Maybe the driver was only trying to scare them. But there was no safe reason for someone to chase two teenagers down a dark hill while striking their bumper. My mother and her boyfriend were trapped inside the car with nowhere else to go. Stopping would leave them alone with the masked person. Getting out was impossible. Their only choice was to keep moving. Her boyfriend drove as fast as he could while trying to maintain control. The car behind them stayed close. The chase continued as they descended. Then, when they cleared the hill and reached the lower road, the masked driver stopped following. The other car did not continue into the more populated area. It remained behind or turned away. My mother and her boyfriend escaped. I do not know whether they drove directly home, reached the party, or stopped somewhere safe afterward. Whatever happened next, the danger ended once they left the hill. The person in the mask did not follow them farther. That detail made the whole thing feel connected to the development at the top. The driver seemed willing to chase them within that isolated area, but did not want to leave it. Maybe the person knew the roads there well. Perhaps they had been waiting for someone to enter. The unfinished homes offered plenty of hiding places and very few witnesses. If my mother's boyfriend had not noticed the parked car, they might have remained there longer. He could have walked farther from their vehicle. My mother might have been left alone inside. The masked person could have approached without either of them realizing. That possibility is frightening enough without bringing anything paranormal into the story. This was probably a human being. A dangerous person does not need supernatural abilities to create a terrifying encounter. Someone waiting silently in a car, face covered, in an empty construction area late at night is already disturbing. The chase and bumper strikes made the threat real. Still, there are ordinary explanations that might make the situation less sinister than it appeared. The white fabric may not have been a mask at all. A pale headrest, cloth, hat, or reflection could have created the impression of a covered face. Headlights can distort objects inside another vehicle. When bright light reflects from glass, the person behind it may appear featureless. My mother and her boyfriend were already lost and uneasy, so they may have interpreted an unclear shape as something more frightening. The person could have been sleeping or resting inside the parked car. When the teenagers' headlights suddenly illuminated them, they may have become angry or suspicious. Perhaps they thought my mother's boyfriend was trespassing, stealing construction materials, or damaging property. They might have followed to record the license plate or scare them away. That could explain why the car stopped following once they left the development. Maybe the person was a security guard. New housing developments sometimes have guards or construction workers watching the property overnight. A guard might have seen a strange car arrive, watched a young man get out, and assumed the occupants were there to vandalize the unfinished homes. The pale covering could have been part of a hood, protective clothing, or something hanging inside the vehicle. The guard then followed them to make sure they left. But a legitimate security guard would not normally strike another vehicle's bumper. They would use lights, a horn, or identify themselves. Repeatedly hitting the car would be reckless and criminal. The behavior did not resemble someone calmly protecting property. Another possibility is road rage. The other driver may have believed my mother's boyfriend had done something offensive. Perhaps the headlights shone directly into their face. Maybe the car blocked the road while he was outside. The person could have become angry and chased them impulsively. But the mask remains difficult to explain. Why was someone sitting motionless in an isolated car with white fabric over their head before any conflict began? It is possible that my mother's memory changed over time. The event happened decades ago. Fear can make details stronger, stranger, or more connected than they originally were. Perhaps the person wore a pale hat rather than a full fabric mask. Maybe the car came close to their bumper without actually hitting it repeatedly. One minor collision could have become several in later retellings. The chase may have lasted less time than it felt. That does not mean the experience was invented. It means memory is not a perfect recording. The main sequence can remain accurate even when small details become uncertain. My mother and her boyfriend were lost. They reached an isolated development. He saw something frightening. They saw a person with a covered head sitting inside a car. That car followed them down the hill aggressively. Those facts alone are enough to make the story disturbing. The time and location added another layer to it. My mother was living in the Bay Area during the period when fear of the Zodiac Killer was still part of the region's atmosphere. The Zodiac had targeted people in Northern California and became known for hiding his identity, sending coded letters, and creating fear through uncertainty. My mother never claimed the masked person was the Zodiac Killer. There is no evidence connecting the encounter to him. The timing and location only made the memory feel more sinister afterward. When people hear about a masked figure chasing teenagers in the Bay Area during the 1970s, it is natural for their minds to make that connection. But many dangerous people existed then, just as they do now. It could have been anyone. The figure may have been a local criminal, a disturbed person, a prankster, an angry worker, or someone who simply enjoyed terrifying young couples. The Zodiac connection is frightening because it shows how little my mother knew about the person behind them. She and her boyfriend did not know whether they had encountered someone harmless, someone violent, or someone already responsible for terrible crimes. They escaped before they had to find out. I sometimes wonder why the masked person was parked in that location. The unfinished neighborhood would have offered privacy. Few people would travel up the hill accidentally, especially late at night. There were no occupied homes nearby to hear shouting or a collision. If someone wanted to wait without being noticed, it would have been a good place. Perhaps the person used the area regularly. Maybe they watched for couples looking for private places. Teenagers sometimes drove into isolated developments to talk, drink, or be alone. Someone who knew that could wait for them. My mother and her boyfriend may have entered the area by accident, but the masked person would not know that. They may have looked like the kind of target the person expected. Her boyfriend getting out of the car could have triggered the situation. The masked driver may have believed he was approaching. Perhaps that was why the figure remained still until he returned to the car. Or maybe the driver had been watching the entire time and was waiting for my mother to be left alone. Her boyfriend's quick return may have interrupted whatever was planned. The chase could have been an attempt to stop them from leaving. That is speculation, but the behavior makes it difficult not to consider. If the person only wanted them off the property, allowing them to leave would have solved the problem. Instead, the driver followed closely and hit their bumper. That suggests anger, panic, or an attempt to force them to stop. Maybe the masked person wanted to move them away from the car before attacking. Perhaps the vehicle contained something the person did not want discovered. They could have been involved in theft, drug use, or another crime inside one of the unfinished homes. When my mother's boyfriend saw them, they may have feared being identified. The chase could have been an attempt to get their license plate or prevent them from reporting what they had seen. However, my mother did not mention seeing stolen property, another victim, or any other criminal activity. They only saw the figure. The person's appearance was what made them flee. There may have been no deeper reason. Some people hide their faces specifically because they want to frighten others. It could have been a planned prank. A group of teenagers may have waited in the development, hoping to scare anyone who entered. One person sat in a car wearing a cloth mask. When a vehicle appeared, they followed it down the hill. The bumper contact may have gone farther than intended. A prank explanation is possible, but it does not make the experience much safer. Chasing a car on a dark hill can cause a crash. Even if the person did not intend murder or kidnapping, reckless behavior could have killed everyone involved. My mother's boyfriend might have lost control. The car could have left the road, struck an unfinished building, or rolled down the hill. The masked driver showed no concern for that risk. I also wonder whether the person truly stopped at the bottom, or whether my mother and her boyfriend simply managed to lose them. There may have been more roads, streetlights, or other traffic once they cleared the development. The driver might have decided it was too risky to continue where witnesses could see the chase. That would explain the sudden end. The hill offered isolation. The lower road offered exposure. Whoever was behind the mask may have wanted to remain unknown more than they wanted to catch the teenagers. When my mother told the story, the image that stood out was not necessarily the chase itself. It was the first sight of the person sitting in the parked car. A chase is active. There is no doubt that something dangerous is happening. But the still figure came before the action. Someone had been waiting in the darkness before my mother and her boyfriend arrived. The headlights revealed the car, but the person inside did not move like someone surprised to be seen. The white covering over the head removed every sign of identity. There was no expression to read, no visible eyes, no mouth, no indication of age or emotion. It was only a human body with a blank, pale head. That is why the image remained so memorable. The figure looked less like a person and more like a warning. Her boyfriend had seen it first while outside the relative protection of the car. I can imagine what that moment must have felt like. He was standing alone in an unfinished development at night. He looked down the road and realized someone was watching from another vehicle. Maybe the figure had turned its covered head toward him. Perhaps it had been facing him the entire time. He had to walk back to the car without knowing whether the stranger would move. The fact that he was visibly panicked when he returned suggests he saw enough to believe they were in immediate danger. He did not casually mention another vehicle. He got into the car and turned around. My mother trusted his fear because she saw the same figure when the headlights landed on it. Then, the chase confirmed that his instincts had been correct. I do not know whether they reported the incident to the police. Teenagers in the 1970s might not have believed officers would take the story seriously. They were lost in a construction area while looking for a party. They may have feared getting in trouble with their parents. They might not have remembered the other car's license plate, especially while trying to escape. If there was no significant damage to their bumper, they may have decided there was nothing useful to report. That is unfortunate, because an official report might have connected the event to other incidents in the area. Perhaps other couples had been chased. Maybe workers had noticed the same car parked among the unfinished homes. The masked person could have been known locally. Without a report, there was no investigation. The story survived only through my mother's memory. It is also possible that authorities would have found nothing. The car might have used false plates or no plates at all. The driver could have left the development immediately. By the time police arrived, the hill would be empty. There would be no proof beyond the teenager's account. The unfinished homes and dark roads would return to normal in daylight. That contrast appears in many frightening experiences. A place that feels dangerous at night looks ordinary the next morning. Construction workers arrive. Tools move. Cars pass. The space fills with normal human activity. No one can see where the masked figure waited. Eventually, the homes are finished and families move in. Children play on the same road where someone once chased two teenagers down the hill. Most residents may never learn anything happened there. My mother's story does not require the supernatural to be terrifying. There was no ghost, impossible movement, or unexplained disappearance. The figure used a car. It followed roads. It hit their bumper. The danger was physical and human. That realism makes the story more disturbing. A paranormal figure can vanish when the lights come on. A human predator may follow you home. My mother and her boyfriend were fortunate that this person stopped at the bottom of the hill. I sometimes think about how easily the story could have ended differently. If their car had stalled, they would have been trapped. If the masked driver had pushed them off the road, no one might have found them until morning. If her boyfriend had walked closer to the parked car instead of returning immediately, the figure could have confronted him outside. If my mother had been alone in their car, she might not have known what was happening until it was too late. Instead, they noticed the danger and reacted quickly. That may be the only reason the story became a frightening memory rather than something worse. There is no way to identify the person now. The event happened too long ago. The development has probably changed completely. The car may have been destroyed years ago. The driver could be dead, imprisoned, or still unknown. Even the exact location may have faded from memory. All that remains is the description. An unmoving human figure. White fabric over the head. A car sitting in darkness among unfinished homes. Then headlights rushing up behind them as they fled down the hill. I do not say the person was the Zodiac killer. That connection is based only on the Bay Area, the decade, and the hidden face. It would be irresponsible to claim more. But understanding what was happening in the region at the time explains why the possibility feels so chilling. My mother and her boyfriend were not living in a world where masked violence existed only in movies. There had been real attacks, real fear, and real uncertainty about who might be responsible. A strange person hiding their identity on an isolated hill could not be dismissed easily. Maybe the driver was a harmless security worker who became aggressive. Maybe it was a prank that went too far. Perhaps it was a criminal frightened of being discovered. Or maybe it was someone waiting for exactly the kind of young couple who took a wrong turn that night. My mother never found out. She only knew that her boyfriend left the car for a few minutes and returned terrified. He showed her the figure sitting down the block. The white-covered head remained completely still under the headlights. Then the car came alive and chased them. It stayed close enough to strike their bumper while they raced down the hill, and the moment they reached the bottom, it stopped. That detail still feels deliberate to me. The person did not want to follow them into the light or near occupied streets. They wanted them only while they were isolated. For years afterward, my mother could probably remember the feeling of looking through the rear window and seeing the other headlights directly behind them. She did not know the driver's face. She did not know their name. She did not know whether they had chosen her and her boyfriend at random or had been waiting for someone all night. She only knew that beneath the white fabric was a human being willing to ram a moving car in the dark. The scariest part of the story is not that they saw someone in a mask. It is that the person seemed prepared. They had chosen an empty neighborhood at the top of a hill. They sat inside a parked car without moving. They waited until they were seen. Then they followed. My mother and her boyfriend escaped because the road eventually brought them back towards civilization. The masked driver did not continue past the hill. Maybe that person was afraid of being recognized. Maybe they knew another car would appear. Or maybe the bottom of the hill was simply the edge of whatever game they were playing. My mother never learned which. She only remembered taking a wrong turn while searching for a party and finding a road where no one should have been waiting. At the top of the hill, the headlights revealed a motionless figure with a white-covered head. At the bottom, the car finally stopped chasing them. And somewhere between those 2 points, my mother realized that the person behind them had never wanted directions, help, or anything ordinary. They had only wanted the teenagers to stop. Asleep, and my younger brother was staying with our father that night. We had dropped him off earlier that day, so I knew he was not supposed to be home. For some reason, I suddenly felt that I needed to look toward the hallway. There was a mirror hanging just outside my bedroom door. From where I was sitting or lying, I could see part of it through the doorway. I have never liked mirrors. Even as a child, they made me uncomfortable, especially at night. There is something disturbing about seeing part of a room through a reflection rather than looking at it directly. The angles feel wrong, and the mirror can show spaces behind you that you are not prepared to see. This mirror reflected the entrance to my mother's bedroom. Normally, I avoided looking at it for too long, if I passed it at night. I tried not to focus on the darker rooms visible in the glass. That night, however, I felt compelled to look. I cannot explain why. I did not hear my mother's door open. There were no footsteps or voices. I simply looked toward the mirror, and in the reflection, I saw someone coming out of her room. It appeared to be a young boy. He was pale and had dark, almost black hair. He was wearing nothing except a pair of boxers. I did not see his face clearly. The angle of the mirror, the distance, and the way he was turned kept me from seeing enough detail to identify his features. But his size, clothing, and general appearance immediately made me think of my little brother. That was my first reaction. I did not think ghost or intruder. I thought, that's my brother. He often slept in my mother's room, so seeing a small boy walk out of her doorway would normally have made sense. For a second, my mind accepted what I was seeing. Then I remembered that my brother was not in the house. We had taken him to our father's place earlier that day. He was miles away. The moment I remembered that, the figure became frightening. I watched it continue down the hallway. It did not look transparent. I could not see through it. It did not glow or flicker. It looked solid, like a real person, with weight and a physical body. Its movements were strange, though. The boy walked in a stiff manner. His posture did not look completely natural. He moved forward without the relaxed motion I would expect from a sleepy child leaving a bedroom. He also did not appear to notice me. He never turned his head toward my room or reacted as though someone were watching him through the mirror. He simply left my mother's doorway and headed toward the stairs. I remained completely still. The figure reached the staircase and began going down. Our stairs were noisy. They creaked under almost everyone's weight, even children. There were certain steps that were nearly impossible to avoid. If someone walked downstairs in the middle of the night, you could normally hear the wood shifting beneath them. The boy made no sound. I watched him descend, but I did not hear a single creak. There were no footsteps, no movement of the handrail, no fabric brushing against the wall. The house remained completely silent. That was the detail that convinced me something was seriously wrong. If it had been my brother, the stairs would have made noise. If it had been an intruder, I should have heard at least some movement. The figure looked solid enough to have weight, yet the staircase did not react to it. I waited. I did not immediately run to my mother's room because I was terrified the boy might still be nearby. If it had reached the bottom of the stairs and realized someone was awake, it could come back. I kept listening for movement downstairs. Nothing happened. No door opened. There was no sound from the kitchen or living room. I did not hear anyone leaving the house. The silence made the situation worse because I had no idea where the figure had gone. I stayed in my room until I believed enough time had passed for it to be safely downstairs. Then I moved. I left my bedroom and ran into my mother's room. I woke her and told her what I had seen. I explained that a pale boy had walked out of her room, passed through the hallway, and gone downstairs without making any sound. I told her that I had first thought it was my brother, before remembering he was at our father's house. My mother was a skeptic. She did not normally believe stories about ghosts or apparitions. Under different circumstances, she might have told me I was tired, imagined a shadow, or mistaken something in the mirror for a person. But she saw how frightened I was. Whatever she thought the explanation might be, she understood that I genuinely believed someone had been inside her room. She reached for the knife she kept nearby. Then she got out of bed and approached the hallway. She called toward the stairs and asked if anyone was there. No one answered. She waited and listened. The house remained silent. Neither of us wanted to search the entire place alone. If the figure had been a real intruder, we had no idea whether he was still downstairs or hiding in another room. The fact that he looked like a child did not necessarily make the situation safe. Someone older could have appeared smaller in the reflection, or there could have been more than one person inside. We went outside and waited on the porch. I was too shaken to remain in the house. My mother contacted the police, and we stayed outside until they arrived. Sitting on the porch should have made me feel safer, but I kept thinking about the mirror. I replayed the sighting repeatedly. The pale body, the dark hair, the stiff walk, the complete silence as he went downstairs. I wondered whether he was watching us from inside the house. Perhaps he had moved behind a curtain or stood near a window. Maybe he had not left at all. When the police arrived, they searched the property. They checked the rooms, closets, and likely places where someone might hide. They did not find anyone. There was no pale boy inside, no stranger, no obvious sign of a person moving through the house. But they did find the back door wide open. That changed everything. Until then, the experience could have been dismissed as something seen in a mirror while tired. The open door provided a possible physical explanation. Someone may actually have entered the house. Perhaps the figure was not an apparition. Maybe I saw a real child or a very young-looking person who had come inside through the back. He might have wandered into my mother's room, realized she was asleep, and left when he noticed someone else was awake. He could have gone downstairs and escaped through the open door before we called the police. That would explain why no one was found. But it would not explain everything. Why did I not hear him on the stairs? Why was he wearing only boxers? Why did he walk so stiffly? Why did he come from my mother's bedroom while she was asleep? And why did he look so much like my younger brother at first glance? The open back door may have had an ordinary explanation, too. Someone in the family could have forgotten to close it properly. The latch might not have caught, and wind could have pushed it open. If the door had been left unlocked, it may have opened gradually during the night without anyone entering. The police finding it open did not prove there had been an intruder. It only meant there was a possible entry and exit point. I tried to remember whether the door had been checked earlier. I could not. Most people do not carefully inspect every entrance before bed unless they already expect danger. It may have been open for hours. Still, knowing that an outside door was wide open made the sighting harder to dismiss. The police could not tell us what had happened. There was no person to question. Nothing appeared stolen. There were no clear footprints or signs of forced entry that I remember. The house was otherwise normal. My mother and I eventually went back inside, but I did not feel safe. Every doorway looked different after that. The stairs seemed darker. The mirror outside my room became almost impossible to look at. I knew that if I glanced into it, I would expect to see the boy coming out of my mother's bedroom again. I kept wondering whether the figure had been real. A real intruder was, in some ways, the most practical explanation. Someone entered through the back door. I happened to see him through the hallway mirror. He walked downstairs and escaped. The event was frightening, but not paranormal. However, a real child wandering into a stranger's house in the middle of the night would be extremely unusual. If he was lost, why did he not speak? Why would he enter my mother's bedroom and stand near her without waking her? Why was he nearly undressed? Maybe he had run away from somewhere nearby. Perhaps he was confused, sleepwalking, or experiencing some kind of crisis. A child in that state might enter the wrong house without understanding where he was. He could have been too frightened or disoriented to speak. The stiff walk might have come from fear, exhaustion, or trying to move quietly. The lack of sound on the stairs could have been because I was too focused on what I saw to notice the quieter creaks. That explanation is possible. But if a lost child had entered and disappeared into the night, I would expect someone in the neighborhood to report him missing. I do not remember hearing anything afterward. No family came asking whether we had seen a boy. The police did not later contact us with an explanation. It is also possible that the figure was not as young as it appeared. The mirror may have distorted his height. A thin adult or teenager could have looked smaller from that angle. Poor lighting might have made pale clothing look like bare skin. What I believed were boxers could have been shorts. The black hair and pale body may have been the only details I interpreted correctly. If it was an adult intruder, the danger was much greater than I realized. He could have entered my mother's room while she slept. Maybe he was watching her or looking for valuables. When he left, he passed through the hallway and escaped before we searched. The fact that he did not react to me may mean he never knew I saw him. I was viewing him indirectly through the mirror. From his position, he may not have been able to see me. That possibility still gives me chills. If he was a real intruder and had noticed me, the night might have ended very differently. The paranormal explanation is that I saw an apparition. The figure may have looked like a child but had no physical body. That would explain why the stairs did not creak. It could move through the house without affecting the floor. Its stiff walk might have been an imitation of human movement rather than the natural motion of a living person. It did not notice me because it was repeating some past action or was unaware of the living people around it. The open back door could have been unrelated. Or it could have opened because of whatever passed through the house. I do not know whether anything unusual had happened there before. I had always disliked mirrors. But that fear began when I was younger and was not necessarily connected to the house. There may have been no history of ghosts or strange children. I had never seen the boy before. I did not see him again afterward. That makes the experience difficult to connect to a haunting. A one-time apparition is possible, but so is a one-time visual mistake. Mirrors can create convincing illusions. They reverse the scene and reduce depth, making it harder to judge where someone is standing. A shadow moving across the hallway could look like a person. Clothing hanging near my mother's door might have shifted. A reflection from outside could have passed through the glass. Because I expected my younger brother to sometimes sleep in her room, my brain may have turned an unclear shape into him automatically. Then, when I remembered he was away, the image became frightening. Perhaps nothing actually walked down the stairs. Maybe I saw a series of shadows and interpreted them as one moving figure. That is possible in low light. The brain does not record every detail before recognizing a familiar form. It sees a rough size, pale area, dark hair like shape and movement, then decides it is a person. Once that decision is made, the rest of the scene may feel clearer than it really was. The figure may have been less solid than I remember. Memory also changes over time. I have replayed the event repeatedly, especially because the police found the door open. Each retelling may have strengthened the boy's outline and movements. The details that felt uncertain that night may now seem definite. That does not mean I imagined everything. It means I have to be careful about claiming exactly what happened. I know I saw something leave my mother's room. I know I believed it was a young boy. I know it moved toward the stairs. Beyond that, my memory may not be perfect. A sleep-related hallucination is another possibility. I had been on my phone late at night and may have been tired. Perhaps I drifted briefly into sleep without noticing. People can experience vivid images while falling asleep or waking. A real room remains visible while dream figures appear inside it. A person may see someone walk through a hallway or stand in a doorway, even though no one is physically present. These hallucinations can look completely solid. They often disappear without the witness noticing a clear moment when they vanished. I may have been awake enough to use my phone, but tired enough for part of my brain to produce a dream image. The mirror could have provided the perfect frame for it. My dislike of mirrors may also have influenced what I saw. If I already felt uneasy looking into them at night, my mind may have been prepared to interpret any movement as threatening. The boy resembled my brother because that was a familiar figure associated with my mother's room. The dream image followed the most logical route through the house, leaving her doorway and going downstairs. The open back door could have been coincidence. That explanation fits many details. But I remember being alert. I was using my phone, not waking from deep sleep. I followed the figure's movement through the reflection. Then I waited, went to my mother, spoke clearly, and stayed awake until police arrived. There was no moment where I suddenly became fully conscious and realized I had been dreaming. The experience felt continuous. That does not rule out a hallucination, but it makes it harder for me to accept completely. My mother's reaction also stayed with me. She was skeptical, yet she believed my fear enough to take the possibility of an intruder seriously. She searched carefully and called the police. The officers found an open door. For one night, even the adults could not simply tell me nothing had happened. Something was wrong, even if we could not identify what. I often returned to the way the figure moved. It looked solid, but not alive in the usual way. Its body seemed stiff, almost as though it were walking, because it remembered how a person was supposed to walk. It did not move with the relaxed carelessness of my brother. It did not seem sleepy, curious, or frightened. It had no visible reaction to the house around it. It simply followed a route, out of my mother's room, into the hallway, down the stairs. That repeated, purposeful movement is one reason I sometimes think it could have been a residual apparition, something replaying an event without awareness. But I have no evidence for that idea. I never learned of a child who had lived or died in the house. There was no story connected to the staircase or my mother's bedroom. Without that history, the explanation is only speculation. The possibility that it was something imitating my brother is even more disturbing. I recognized the figure as him before remembering he was away. Maybe that was only because they were similar in size. But what if the resemblance was intentional? Something could have used the appearance of a familiar child, so I would not react immediately. It did not need to copy his face, because I never saw it clearly. The body, hair, and clothing were enough. That idea frightens me, but it goes far beyond what I can prove. The simplest explanation remains that I saw a real person, a visual illusion, or a sleep-related image. All three are more likely than something supernatural copying my brother. Even so, none explains every detail comfortably. If it was an intruder, the silent stares and unusual appearance remain strange. If it was an illusion, the movement seemed too complete and consistent. If it was a hallucination, I felt too awake. If it was an apparition, the open back door is an unnecessary physical detail. Maybe the truth is a combination. Perhaps I saw an actual intruder but misremembered some details because of fear. He may have been a thin teenager rather than a young boy. He may have worn shorts and a light shirt that blended into his pale skin. The stairs may have creaked, but my attention was too focused on the mirror to register the sound. He might have left through the open back door moments later. That explanation requires no ghost. It also means my mother and I were in real danger. Sometimes I prefer the apparition. A ghost walking silently through the house is frightening, but it did not hurt anyone. A living person entering my mother's bedroom while she slept is much worse. There is no comforting answer. If the boy was not real, then I saw something I cannot explain. If he was real, then someone entered our house, stood near my sleeping mother, and escaped without ever being identified. I still dislike mirrors. That experience reinforced every fear I had about them. A mirror allows you to witness something without being part of the scene from its perspective. I saw the figure, but it may not have known I was watching. I was hidden behind the angle of the glass. That separation made the moment feel unreal. It was like observing something happening in another version of the hallway. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had looked directly out of my door instead of watching the reflection. Would the boy have been there? Would I have seen him more clearly? Maybe there would have been no one in the real hallway, only a figure inside the mirror. I never tested that. I watched until he went downstairs, then waited before moving. By the time I entered the hall, he was gone. I also wonder what would have happened if I had called out, believing it was my brother. He might have turned. I could have seen his face. If it was a real child, perhaps he would have answered. If it was something else, I am not sure I would have wanted its attention. My silence may have protected me. Or it may have allowed a real intruder to leave without being stopped. There is no way to know now. The police searched the house and found no one. My mother was safe. Nothing was missing. My brother was still with our father. Life returned to normal. But the image never completely left me. I still see the pale body reflected in the hallway mirror, the black hair, the bare back and boxers, the stiff steps toward the staircase. I remember waiting for the familiar creak of wood under his feet. It never came. Then I remember waking my mother, standing outside on the porch, and watching the police search the house. At the end of it, all they found was the back door standing wide open. Perhaps that was the answer. A real person entered and escaped. Maybe I should be grateful I saw him before he did anything worse. But when I think about the way he walked and the complete silence of the stairs, I still question whether the open door explained anything at all. I saw something that looked like a pale young boy leave my mother's bedroom. It passed through the house as if it knew where it was going. It never looked toward me. It never made a sound. And whether it was an apparition or a living intruder, the most disturbing part remains the same. For some unknown amount of time before I looked into that mirror, it had been alone in the room with my sleeping mother.
The broadcast is ending, but some voices do not disappear when the radio goes quiet. Maybe one of tonight's confessions will stay with you. Maybe you will remember it the next time your phone rings at an odd hour, or when you hear something outside after midnight. Leave a comment with the story that got under your skin the most. Subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more stories from the people who called in after something went wrong.